his hair is sort of catching the light. His eyebrows are sort of knit together. And he's sort of staring straight down the barrel of the camera and sort of frowning at the guy taking them, or whoever it was taking the mugshot. I think he's rather pleased with it.
Donald Trump, of course, had to hand himself in for processing at a jail in Georgia ahead of a forthcoming trial for racketeering and trying to interfere with the 2020 presidential election. He has described these latest electoral fraud charges against him as a travesty of justice. Well, the former president had his fingerprints taken as well as that mugshot. The Times US correspondent Will Pavia is in Georgia.
Donald Trump is sort of glowering slightly towards the camera. His hair is sort of catching the light. His eyebrows are sort of knit together. And he's sort of staring straight down the barrel of the camera and sort of frowning at the guy taking them, or whoever it was taking the mugshot. I think he's rather pleased with it. I mean, he actually looks, sometimes a mugshot can make you look deranged or just, slightly, naturally slightly sort of bewildered and uncertain, whereas it almost looks as if he's quite prepared for this. And indeed, the Trump campaign is already putting it on T-shirts, and he's tweeting it out on his Twitter account for the first, starting that up again for the first time in years. So, he seems to think it's a plus.
Remind us what he's charged with before we talk about his response to all of this.
So he faces 13 felonies, which are all related to a sort of general effort to overturn the election in Georgia. But they're sort of racketeering charges. So the idea is that there was a criminal organization or criminal enterprise that was doing these things, that was making false claims, that was trying to persuade elected officials to sort of overturn the vote. And there's also sort of charges to do with sort of trying to sort of essentially break into voting systems and sort of obtain data.
Racketeering is always fascinating to a UK audience because it's not something that we have here, and it kind of is, in people's mind, you kind of think of mob movies.
You do, and it's very striking here because Rudy Giuliani, who's one of his co-defendants in this case, really made his name in the 1980s by prosecuting the mob, by using these what they call RICO charges here, which are sort of they're to do with racketeering, he's famous for using this way of charging defendants to bring down these sort of leading members of the New York mafia, and suddenly here he is being charged himself with racketeering. It's just a very, very strange thing to see. In the case in Georgia, the district attorney who's bringing the charges, Fannie Willis, has sort of said that she's a huge fan of racketeering charges and of that manner of charging somebody. And in this case, it's allowed her, whereas, for instance, the federal case against Donald Trump is quite sort of focused and targeted on specific things and specific sort of federal laws. Bringing racketeering charges allows you to almost tell the whole story, to say, no, this was a whole organization, and this was everything that was happening, and here's how it all fits together, which is why we've got a sort of 96-page indictment, and it's a huge sort of rather complicated case in Georgia, and no one quite knows how long it might take.
You've talked, Will, about how the Trump campaign will use his mugshot as kind of something to get people behind him. He's already talked, hasn't he, in the past about how this is a witch hunt. What's his reaction been after he left the jail today?
Well, he sort of reiterated what he's said all along. He said that it's a very sad day, and that he was merely challenging an election which he believed was rigged, and he's got every right to challenge it, and it's his own sort of free speech. And he's tried to sort of draw a comparison with Stacey Abrams, who was a Democratic candidate who ran for governor in 2018. Now, she lost to Brian Kemp, I beg your pardon. And she said she did actually accept the results, but I think she said afterwards that she thought that there had been voter suppression. So it's slightly different, really, if you saying that you think that there might have been, some people might have found it hard to vote. I think, is probably slightly different to what Trump was doing, which was sort of saying on the phone to the Secretary of State, "Could you find me 11,000 votes?" And this part of the charges are sort of to do with a false, slate of electors that they were going to try and sort of draft in instead of the real one. So, but that's the comparison he's making, and he's saying, "I'm merely challenging the election results, which I felt were rigged, and it's sort of a free speech thing, and I should be allowed to challenge elections, which I think are false." So he sort of said that, and then he sort of said, "I'll see you all soon," and he got on his plane.
We know that Trump supporters are very passionate in their support of him. Many were outside the court. I was reading with interest your piece in the Times today online about how many were outside the court and the things they were saying. Just tell us what they said to you outside the jail.
So you had people who'd come from a long way. I spoke to a pastor who'd come from Tennessee, and he'd brought one of his constituents with him. They'd got up at 3 a.m. and got on a plane. And they were sort of felt that they were there both because they supported Trump and they agreed with him that the election was rigged, and they were sort of there to provide moral support for him. And then you also had people who were sort of a bit more local who had come because they were involved in sort of campaigns during the 2020 election and afterwards, because they also thought there had been sort of voter fraud. I was talking to a lady from a nearby county who described, she was talking about being from sort of a red county, a county that did go for Donald Trump, but she sort of acknowledged that Georgia is changing and it's becoming a bluer state. And that was, of course, what happened in 2020. It went for Biden. So she was sort of talking about how they were sort of, really trying to get out the vote, and that she was an organizer for Trump. And so she was there as part of that as well. You have these groups that you sort of see at all of these events. There's a large group called Blacks for Trump, which sort of is what it says on the tin, I suppose. And you then have these sort of personalities who come along as well. And on the other side, you have there's a man from Miami who seems to be at every indictment, who's always dressed in sort of prison clothes, and holding a sign that says something along the lines of sort of "lock him up." And so you had a few people for the other side, and actually debates were sort of breaking out between the two groups. You'd see the occasional argument, and particularly after Trump left, there were people really thrashing it out on the patch of grass next to the jail.
That is the Times US correspondent Will Pavia. He's been in Georgia.